First, they make you feel like the most special person in the world. Your brain becomes chemically addicted to it. Then, suddenly, they change the rules. This isn't an accident, it's a strategy.
Have you ever found yourself in a relationship that felt, well, less like a partnership and maybe more like this high-stakes, all-consuming drama? A connection that feels so intense, so incredibly defining, that even thinking about stepping away feels like, I don't know, facing a cliff edge.
It's a paradox we hear about constantly. It feels like it holds the promise of real love, but what it actually delivers is this constant gnawing anxiety of total loss. It's a really potent, dangerous mix.
Exactly. And, we were recently hit with a question that was just so raw, so honest, it immediately jumped out as the focus for this deep dive. A listener actually asked us, I no longer know if what I feel is love or addiction.
That really is the core question, isn't it? That line, when your whole internal world becomes dedicated not to the joy of connection, but to desperately seeking validation, or maybe just trying to avoid that feeling of withdrawal. You fundamentally shifted. It's gone from conscious love to something more like, well, compulsive consumption.
And that's really our mission today. We're diving deep into how some relationships systematically become these consuming nightmares, but they're disguised as dreams. We're going to explore how our own biology can actually be weaponized against us, how reality itself can be eroded, and, crucially, how you can reclaim your personal power, get back to your essential self. So if this conversation is already resonating with you, if you're feeling this deep down, we really want you to be part of this community. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. Your engagement, it genuinely helps us figure out what relationship psychology deep dives to prioritize. It ensures we keep bringing you content that shines a light on these really confusing, high-stakes emotional challenges.
Definitely. Because, after honestly, years of listening to hundreds of these stories, the patterns start to emerge. And they reveal a conclusion that's painful, it's difficult to process sometimes, but it's there. Some people don't truly love. They systematically consume.
Consume. That word consume, it really implies taking without giving back, doesn't it? Burning someone's energy without replenishing the source. When we talk about emotional manipulation, I think most of us picture something really obvious, maybe aggressive, like a textbook villain. But the way it's described here, this form of offense is, well, far more subtle,
Wow.
more gradual.
It almost has to be subtle, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, the victim would just leave immediately. The consumption is so insidious, so gradual, that by the time you, the victim, recognize the pattern, you've already lost pieces of yourself, pieces you didn't even know were detachable in a way. It's like this slow-motion dismantling of your self-trust. It leaves you in this permanent state of confusion, of self-doubt. And this isn't just, random interpersonal friction. It feels intentional, strategic. It's emotional theft, really, carried out by people who are masters of psychological deception.
Okay, so that brings us straight to what seems like a major misunderstanding. When we discuss victims of this kind of emotional consumption, I think a lot of people assume the manipulator is looking for someone who's already vulnerable, maybe weak.
That's probably the biggest protective myth we need to shatter today. Think about it. If a manipulator goes after someone weak, that person doesn't actually have enough emotional substance, enough energy, or enough capacity for connection to sustain them for long. They aren't looking for someone who needs fixing. They're looking for a fuel source.
So they're actually looking for strength.
Precisely. They seek out women who are strong, often profoundly empathetic, deeply intelligent, and who possess this great, almost overflowing capacity to love. These manipulators need someone with an abundant internal resource pool to take from. Their whole existence kind of hinges on siphoning off that abundance.
Wow. Okay, that makes perfect sense, but it's also chilling. You need a strong foundation if you're going to steal from it. But how do they spot these women? Is there like a sign above their heads?
Yeah. It's more like they have this, well, we call it a special antenna. This antenna seems to detect those qualities they themselves lack. That genuine capacity for love, the ability to maintain a real heart connection, and interestingly, the resilience to be vulnerable without kind of losing their core essence. These are often women who haven't yet learned to feel that incredible emotional light they have. And the manipulator sees this light as basically a limitless power source, the perfect candidate for emotional consumption.
Okay, so once they've identified that target, this really devastating process kicks off. And it starts with a high, doesn't it? The thing that hooks the victim. The psychological term is love bombing. So we'll maybe dig into that mechanism because it feels euphoric, right? But that euphoria is the danger itself.
Absolutely. The love bombing phase is essentially chemical conditioning. It's designed for rapid, overwhelming dependency. The manipulator works incredibly fast, making the victim feel utterly special, profoundly desired, completely understood, truly seen, often in ways they've literally never experienced before. They mirror the victim's deepest desires, their expressed needs, almost perfectly.
And this is where our own biochemistry gets involved.
Exactly. The brain is the target here, and it gets flooded with these high-octane happiness chemicals. Specifically, we're talking about two really crucial ones, dopamine and oxytocin. Dopamine, that's the seeking chemical. It creates the motivation, that intense focus, the feeling of urgency and reward, the sheer intensity of the attention, the constant texts, the declarations of instant destiny. That's a huge dopamine surge. You become driven to seek that source constantly.
Okay, so dopamine creates the seeking, the wanting more. But what about the bond, that feeling of deep, almost instant trust?
That's the oxytocin. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone. People call it the cuddle chemical, or the hormone of trust. When a connection speeds up unnaturally fast, just bombarding you with intimacy and validation, your brain releases massive amounts of oxytocin. This chemical is basically designed to bypass your natural skepticism, to accelerate attachment. In a healthy relationship, oxytocin builds slowly, over shared experiences, trust built over time. In love bombing, it's like a deliberate overdose. It creates this instant, powerful, and often quite unconditional bond of trust with someone you barely know.
So the manipulators essentially hijacking the nervous system's own tools for safe, healthy attachment, forcing this immediate, intense bond. The victim isn't just emotionally invested at this point, they're literally chemically addicted to how this person makes them feel.
It becomes physiological dependency. The nervous system gets conditioned to expect, even rely on, those extreme manufactured highs. It starts to equate the manipulator with survival, with ultimate happiness. And that conditioning, that reliance on an external source for your internal chemical state, that's the crucial setup for all the manipulation that comes next.
Okay, so the system is now primed. The victim's brain basically believes this relationship is the only place to get those intoxicating levels of dopamine and oxytocin. They're expecting this constant euphoria, this high. Now, you mentioned a critical pivot, the rule change that really cements the addiction. This sounds like where the true horror begins.
This is where the genius and the cruelty of the consuming personality really shows. Once that dependency is established, that constant supply of validation and attention gets abruptly interrupted. The relationship shifts from consistent reward to what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. That initial flood of attention becomes sporadic, unpredictable. That steady stream of validation gets replaced by sudden, subtle criticism, or sometimes worse, just indifference.
And the emotional availability, that feeling of deep sharing that just transforms into unexplained distance. Maybe coldness.
Precisely. The manipulator just moves the goalposts arbitrarily. One day you're the absolute center of their universe. The next you might be met with silence or confusion or maybe some manufactured slight, some small offense. For the victim, whose brain is basically screaming for that required chemical input, this shift is agonizing. It triggers immediate withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, obsession, panic.
Can we go a bit deeper into the neurological mechanism here? Because that sounds like pure psychological torture. Why does making the reward intermittent make it more addictive than if it were just a constant flow?
It's counterintuitive, isn't it? But when the reward is constant, the brain actually habituates. It says, okay, this is the new normal, the baseline. But when the reward becomes unpredictable, when you have no idea when the next dose of love or approval or even just attention will arrive, the brain kicks into this obsessive, high alert, almost survival mode.
This is that famous analogy you mentioned before.
Yes, the slot machine analogy. Slot machines are basically the perfect psychological model for addiction via intermittent reinforcement. It's the uncertainty of the payout that drives the compulsive behavior. Just keep pulling the lever, right? Ignoring the massive emotional costs, the resource costs. Because that high-stakes seeking behavior is driven entirely by the hope, the possibility, that the previous reward, that jackpot feeling, will suddenly reappear.
So the victim isn't really seeking a genuine connection anymore, or even relationship quality. They're just seeking to restore that chemical balance. That initial high the manipulator deliberately withdrew. They get stuck spinning this emotional slot machine.
Exactly. The brain gets locked in this loop. And when you finally do receive that tiny intermittent dose, maybe a sudden compliment, after days of silence, a weekend where they're briefly attentive, a fleeting apology, the dopamine surge is actually exponentially higher than if the love had been steady all along. That brief, intense relief validates all the time, all the effort, all the pain you've invested. It solidifies the belief that if you just try harder, if you just push one more time, the jackpot will come back for good. The victim really will do anything to get that chemical high back, and that solidifies this deep toxic dependence.
That really explains why it's so incredibly hard for the victim to leave. The pain of the withdrawal, that crushing anxiety, the frantic seeking it, gets misinterpreted by the nervous system as proof that the manipulator is somehow essential for survival.
It's cognitive dissonance turned up to 11. Logically, you might know this person is causing you immense pain, but your addicted brain insists they are the only source of relief from that pain. And this obsessive chasing, this constant consumption of the victim's own energy, think about the sleepless nights, the anxious texts, the desperate attempts to fix things that becomes the primary fuel that feeds the manipulator. Your struggle becomes their supply.
Okay, so once that dependency is really locked in through this slot machine cycle, the manipulator can then, it sounds like, safely move to the third step, systematically dismantling the victim's internal world, their sense of self. This is what we're calling the erosion of reality.
Yes, and this phase is often dominated by gaslighting. It's a sophisticated process, really, of making the victim doubt their own memory, their perception, even their fundamental sanity. The ultimate goal is to break the victim's trust in their own senses, their own interpretation of events.
Can you give us some specific examples, maybe some of the language used? Because these phrases can sound so innocent on the surface, yet they carry this massive psychological weight.
The language is key, and it's often phrased as concern, which makes it harder to spot. Instead of a direct lie, it might be a query like, "Are you sure you remember that correctly? You know how stressed you get sometimes." Or the classic, "I never said that. You must be twisting my words again. And of course you're being too sensitive, or you always blow things way out of proportion." The underlying implication is always that the problem isn't the situation, it's solely within the victim's unstable mental state.
The consequence of that must be just profound.
It's crushing. Slowly, incrementally, your confidence in your own perception just crumbles. The victim literally loses their internal compass. They become dependent on the manipulator to tell them what's real, what happened, how they should feel. They stop trusting their gut because they've been told it's too emotional, or they're imagining things countless times.
And at the same time, this erosion of the internal world is often matched by an erosion of their external world, right? Through subtle isolation tactics.
Exactly. And the isolation is usually woven in with extreme subtlety. It's rarely a direct command like, "Don't see your friends." Instead, the manipulator might express concern about one of the victim's friendships, suggesting a friend is jealous, or maybe toxic, or doesn't really support the relationship. They might create these small conflicts, often positioning themselves as hurt or misunderstood, which causes the victim to instinctively pull back from their loved ones, either to protect the manipulator's feelings or, honestly, just to avoid the drama that erupts whenever they connect with others.
So the victim starts isolating themselves just to keep the peace in the relationship.
Precisely. The underlying message becomes, "See, I'm the only one who truly understands you, your sensitivity, your complexity." The goal is to make the victim an emotional island, where the manipulator is the only bridge, the only safe harbor, even though they're the storm. The victim ends up losing connection not just with their own sense of self, but also with their genuine healthy support network. This leaves them completely vulnerable, completely dependent on the manipulator for continued connection and, unfortunately, continued manipulation.
So by this stage, the victim has been fully converted into what the source material calls emotional supply. Their entire existence starts revolving around feeding the manipulator's needs.
Their energy, their time, their constant attention, their validation, even their suffering tragically, even their pain, all of it becomes fuel for the manipulator's intensely fragile ego. We really have to look behind that sophisticated mask, the charm, the control. The truth is often terrifyingly mundane. These individuals can be profoundly empty inside.
Can you elaborate a bit on that emptiness? What does that lack of a core self actually look like in a person?
Well, they often lack a true, coherent identity. They don't possess real internalized self-esteem that comes from within. They often can't regulate their own emotions independently because developmentally they may never have formed a solid emotional core. Therefore, they have to constantly project this grandiose, often false image of themselves, and that image requires continuous external validation, external mirroring, just to stay inflated. Without it, they feel like they might collapse.
It sounds like they're living this perpetual performance, always needing an audience.
They are. They really are. They function in a way like emotional black holes. They require the constant light, the energy, the love of others specifically often, the immense loving capacity of the victim just to avoid that terrifying internal experience of, well, disappearing or feeling utterly worthless. The victim's love, their reactivity, their attention, it acts like the necessary oxygen that sustains the manipulator's false self. It makes the relationship not about love or partnership at all, but about essential psychological survival for the consumer.
Wow. Okay, the dynamic you've described so far sounds deeply entrenched, and frankly, it feels overwhelmingly bleak. But this deep dive is ultimately about finding the path back, right, back to the self. For anyone listening who might be recognizing these patterns, you highlighted a critical viewpoint change that kicks off recovery, shifting responsibility.
This is probably the single most important message for anyone who's been through this. The manipulation is not your fault. You didn't choose to be exploited. You likely entered that relationship with an open heart, maybe a deep capacity to love, and that's a strength, never a flaw. You are only responsible for your ability to choose your response now that you understand the mechanism, now that you see the blueprint.
So the knowledge itself, understanding how it works, becomes the primary tool for recovery. And maybe the biggest, most empowering piece of that knowledge is realizing the power reversal.
Absolutely. The central delusion in these relationships is that the victim desperately needs the manipulator. The absolute fundamental truth is the reverse. The manipulator depends on the victim far more than the victim ever depended on them. Realizing this is the key that unlocks the cage. Think about it. Without your emotional energy, without your reactivity, without your constant attention, the manipulator has no fuel. They become irrelevant. Their fragile, constructed image starts to collapse because the external validation source is gone.
Let's maybe call this the irrelevance test.
Yeah.
For someone listening who might be grappling with trying to disengage right now, what does stopping that supply actually look like in practice?
Yeah.
And how might they observe the manipulator's, well, probably frantic reaction?
The goal is to become emotionally inert to them. Stop chasing, stop explaining yourself over and over. Stop reacting to the provocations. When the victim becomes unresponsive, just emotionally unavailable to them, the manipulator almost always immediately escalates. They might become more insistent, sometimes dramatically doubling down on those early love-bombing tactics to try and hook you back in. Or conversely, they might resort to rage, threats, guilt-tripping, basically anything to provoke a reaction to restore that supply. They're frantically testing the boundaries, trying to see if you're still available to be manipulated.
So when the victim stops reacting, the manipulator actually intensifies their strategies. And the moment the victim stops validating the ego, the manipulator, lacking that internal core, starts to crumble because their external source of validation is just dried up.
The power was always yours. They simply borrowed it, in a sense, and then weaponized it against you. The path out of this labyrinth isn't about changing them. It's purely internal. It's about reconnecting with that strong, intuitive person you were before this relationship began. It means building that internal assurance, that deep knowing that your value is non-negotiable. It doesn't require their constant intermittent validation anymore.
That reconstruction of self, though, it must be exhausting. You essentially have to rebuild your reality based on your own perception again, not theirs.
It requires immense courage, no doubt. You have to mourn the loss not just of the person, but of the fantasy. You have to face the painful truth that the intense love you thought you found wasn't real love. It was perhaps a projection of your own needs onto a very masterful actor. You have to let go of the fantasy of who you wish they were and accept the stark reality of who they showed themselves to be, an emotional consumer. That painful acceptance, though, that's the moment you fully reclaim ownership of your life, your choices, your future.
And once you step into that kind of emotional clarity, it seems like one of the most profound lessons in recovery becomes vital, learning to distinguish between intensity and intimacy.
Oh, this is a massive hurdle for the nervous system. Manipulators are brilliant at generating emotional intensity. They thrive on drama, volatility, those adrenaline roller coasters, high-stakes crises. They often equate conflict and chaos with passion or depth.
But real intimacy is pretty much the opposite of chaos, isn't it?
Real intimacy is calm, it's consistent, it feels safe, it doesn't need crises or pain or uncertainty to validate its existence. It's built slowly in the quiet, sometimes mundane, everyday moments of mutual respect, shared vulnerability, and consistent care.
The challenge then becomes, for the person recovering, that their nervous system, which got conditioned to thrive on the intensity of that roller coaster, often interprets calm and safety as, well, boring. Or worse.
That is the exact stumbling block for so many. Your system was effectively programmed to interpret that adrenaline spike, that chaos, as love or vitality. And peace, consistency. That starts to feel like apathy, or even more terrifying, like the quiet before the storm, the precursor to abandonment or danger. Recovery means consciously retraining your nervous system. It needs time and repeated exposure to secure, reliable, sometimes wonderfully boring peace, to relearn that calm actually is safety. It's a refuge, not a warning sign. You're essentially detoxing from emotional drama.
Okay, so we've established that a big part of the manipulator's toolkit is making the victim doubt their own intuition, convincing them they're too sensitive or imagining things. To move forward, the victim has to recalibrate their emotional GPS, as you put it. How does someone actively begin to trust that inner voice again, especially after years of being told it's wrong?
Well, the first thing to realize is your intuition never actually stopped working. It was just consistently silenced, dismissed, invalidated. Healing really starts with consciously deciding to honor the wisdom of your body again. The mind can get easily confused by the manipulator's words, their justifications, their gaslighting. But the body rarely lies. That knot in your stomach you kept ignoring. The unexplained anxiety that washed over you, that feeling of heaviness or just wrongness. Those were always your body's signals, your intuition attempting to warn you.
So reconnecting with intuition is almost literally about listening to those subtle physical discomforts, those feelings that were previously ignored or rationalized away.
Exactly. It's about creating moments of stillness, maybe just pausing and asking yourself, what is my body telling me right now?
Hmm.
And then this is the crucial part, honoring that information, valuing it, perhaps even above external validation or explanations. That inner voice deserves its place as your most reliable emotional GPS. And as you begin this process, it's almost inevitable you'll have to address the heavy burden of guilt.
Right. Guilt for not seeing the red flag sooner, guilt for the time lost, guilt for believing the illusion in the first place.
We really have to keep reiterating this. Vulnerability, the capacity for hope, the ability to love deeply, these are profound human strengths. They are not failures. You likely acted from a place of abundance and trust. The goal now isn't to harden your heart to become cynical, it's to cultivate deep discernment. You have to use this painful knowledge to become an expert, really, at distinguishing between someone who genuinely loves you and supports your whole being, and someone who simply needs you as supply.
Can we break down some practical differences? Things a healed person learns to recognize in daily interactions.
Absolutely. Someone who truly loves you generally wants you to grow. They celebrate your successes genuinely. They encourage you to pursue your independent dreams, your passions. They support your friendships and connections outside the relationship. They offer consistent encouragement, not control.
Okay. And someone who needs you.
Someone who needs you as supply will, often subtly but sometimes overtly, try to keep you small, dependent, maybe isolated. They might feel threatened or jealous when you accomplish something. They might discourage your projects or create conflict and discomfort whenever you try to spend time with loved ones. They need you focused solely on providing them attention and validation. The core difference often boils down to this. Love provides a sense of peace overall. Need tends to create chaos.
That really sounds like the foundation of real mature love we should all be aiming for.
Yes. Real love isn't meant to be an emotional roller coaster. It's more like a stable, consistent base from which you can confidently fly, explore, be yourself. It should make you feel more like yourself, more autonomous, more capable, not less. And this level of conscious, healthy love absolutely exists. It's deserved. But the journey there requires first healing and recognizing that you are complete and whole on your own, independent of anyone else's validation.
Before we wrap up, we really should touch upon the deeper healing that's often necessary. Because manipulators don't just target surface-level emotions, do they? They seem to exploit deeper patterns, often rooted in childhood.
Yes, manipulators often possess this uncanny, almost magical ability to detect your unresolved childhood wounds. Those lingering fears of abandonment, maybe rejection, feelings of unworthiness. They seem to know exactly where to apply pressure to activate those sensitive points because those old wounds can create an internal vacuum that their manufactured intensity rushes in to fill.
So, simply understanding the manipulation intellectually isn't always enough. The pattern could potentially repeat if that underlying vulnerability isn't addressed.
The healing really needs to be integral, and it takes courage. We often need to consciously work on those unconscious patterns, those old beliefs that might make us vulnerable to intense but unsafe connections. Becoming conscious of these underlying vulnerabilities actually acts as a powerful shield. When you actively work to heal the part of you that, say, fears abandonment, it becomes almost impossible for a manipulator to hold that fear hostage over you anymore. It's like building up your emotional immune system.
And once that internal strength, that healed core, is more established, the critical skill of setting healthy boundaries kind of falls into place more naturally.
Yeah, exactly. And these aren't boundaries built from fear, where you feel like you have to erect these high protective walls around your heart, shutting everyone out. They are healthy boundaries built on a foundation of rock-solid self-love and intrinsic value. This means learning to say, simply and without debilitating guilt, "This doesn't serve me," or "I choose not to participate in this drama," without feeling the need to offer lengthy explanations or justifications or seek their approval for your choice.
When you stop feeling like you have to apologize for having needs or setting limits.
Precisely. And when your internal vibration shifts, when you clearly value yourself, when your boundaries are unambiguous, you naturally change your magnetic frequency, so to speak.
Right.
You stop attracting people who operate primarily from a place of need and consumption, and you start attracting people who are on a similar frequency. Those who also know how to love consciously, consistently, and from a place of genuine abundance and respect. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow, what a truly transformative deep dive this has been. We started with that really agonizing question of confusion. Is it love or is it addiction? And we've walked through the systematic blueprint of emotional consumption. But more importantly, we've illuminated the path back to clarity, back to self. The woman, or man, who consciously chooses to step away from this dynamic, they're fundamentally different afterward, aren't they?
Absolutely. She understands the critical difference between the manufactured intensity of addiction and the quiet, solid safety of true intimacy. She knows her worth is non-negotiable. She will no longer accept crumbs because she's realized she deserves and must demand the full banquet of conscious, respectful love.
And maybe the ultimate revelation, the one that makes all the pain survivable, is realizing this. The power, the validation, the profound love that the victim was so desperately chasing in the manipulator. It was always within themselves. They just needed the space, the quiet, the healing to reconnect with that fundamental truth.
And you know, when one person recovers their power, heals those deep wounds, and finds genuine emotional freedom, she doesn't just help herself, she becomes like a powerful lighthouse, illuminating the path for others who might still be navigating that painful darkness. The most important love you will ever find truly is the one you cultivate for yourself. When you know your value deep down, you simply stop accepting less. And then you start attracting relationships that reflect that abundance back to you.
We really want to keep diving into these foundational relationship psychology issues, the ones that truly impact your life. So, if this deep dive resonated with your experience or maybe sparked a vital piece of understanding, please engage with us. Like this discussion to show your support. Comment below to share your thoughts or experiences, and most importantly, subscribe to join this growing community focused on building conscious relationships.
Yes, please use that comments section. Suggest topics for our future relationship psychology deep dives. Your experiences, your questions, your challenges, they really guide our focus. They ensure we tackle the most relevant issues on the path to healing and finding that conscious, healthy love we all deserve.
Now, as you take this knowledge and integrate it into your life, let's leave you with this final, maybe provocative thought to mull over as you move forward. What is the single, simple, boundary-setting action you can take today, maybe even right now, to finally honor that subtle internal voice you might have been silencing? And in doing so, finally turn down the volume on external drama and consciously choose the quiet refuge of peace.